Inside this lecture, let's try to understand more details on how to export the components and import the components inside any React application. Whatever export and import concept that I'm going to discuss inside this lecture, they're not specific to React, but they are in general JavaScript concepts. If you go to the main.jsx, you'll be able to see few import statements, they have these curly braces, whereas other import statements, they don't have any curly brace. There is a difference between these two syntaxes based upon how we are exporting the functions or functional components inside JavaScript. Accordingly, we need to use the import statements inside our code. This is going to be interesting and I'm going to discuss in detail about this. You need to be very curious throughout your career. Whenever you see this kind of different syntaxes at different places, you need to ask yourself why different syntaxes are being followed. What is the reason behind them? I may not be able to cover all interesting possible scenarios inside this course, but as a developer, be curious, please explore, and that's how you will learn more and more about any technology or language or framework or library. I hope you agree with me. Let's go to the app.jsx. As of now, we are using class header component. Let me revert back to the header so that we will continue to use functional components only. After making this change, let me go to the header component. This is a functional component. Here, we are trying to export these component using export to default. You need to use the default keyword after export whenever you want to mark your function or component as a default export from this file. Inside a file, we can define any number of components or any number of functions, though the standard is always to define a single component inside a single file, but it is technically possible to define multiple components or multiple functions inside a single file. In such scenarios, you need to mark one of the main content or main function or main component as a default so that whenever someone is trying to import a component or a function from this file, the default exported function or component will be used in the import statement. I'll show more details about this. But before that, let me show you another style of exporting your component. As of now, I'm trying to mention this export default header here. Instead, we can also follow other approach as well. As of now, I have commented this line of code. The other approach that we can follow is instead of creating this function component using this arrow function, we can try to create the functional component using plain JavaScript function. For example, I can try to mention export default function, and this is the function name, and inside the function, I'm going to have all my business logic within curly braces. After the function name, we should also give empty parentheses. In my case, since my function is not accepting any input parameters, this parenthesis will be empty. Otherwise, you can mention the input parameters as well. Here, if you see, we have defined a functional component, and at the same time, we're trying to export that functional component as well using the default. Whenever you are trying to export a component or a JavaScript function with the help of default, in such cases, you don't need to mention the curly braces inside the import statement. Now let's try to understand the other style of exporting and importing where we are forced to use the curly braces inside the import statement. If you go to the header.jsx, as of now we have a single component with the name header, the same we are trying to export with the help of default. What I'll do is I'll try to copy the same function one more time inside the same file, but this time if I try to save, I'll get some compilation problems because I'm trying to have the same function name inside a same file. To resolve them, I can try to rename this header to header1, followed by I need to remove this default as well because I can't mention default for two different export statements. Let me save this change. Now all my compilation issues are resolved. I'll go to the app.jsx, and this time to import the header1 inside this file, I need to mention curly braces, and inside the curly braces, I need to type header1. Without these curly braces, it is not going to work. Let me take this header1 and replace here. If I go to the UI, I'm going to get the same output. I hope you're clear with the syntaxes of import statement and export statement. Let me revert back to header, and I'll also remove these header1 related code changes inside the import statement. Let me go to the header.jsx. Here also, I will delete the header1 function because we don't need this. Just for our demo purpose, I have created duplicate function. While you're trying to mention the export statement, either you can follow this approach or you can directly mention export statement just before your function definition. But to use this syntax, you need to make sure you are creating the functions or components using plain JavaScript functions, but not the arrow functions. I also have a couple of slides explaining you about how to export and import components inside React applications. As we discussed, there are two ways of exporting components or JavaScript functions. The very first one is default export. We need to use this to export one main thing from a file. No curly braces are needed when importing. I also mentioned an example for your quick revisions that you're going to do in future. So here I have mentioned export default before the function definition. And since this is an default export, I don't need to use the curly brace inside my import statement. The other export that we have discussed is called as named export, because here we're not using any default keyword. We're trying to export by using the name of the component or name of the function itself. Here I have a file where we have two different components. The very first one is header, the other one is footer. Header I have marked as default to export. The other one is a normal named export. If someone is trying to use these two components inside another file, this is how they need to import. The header can be imported directly without curly braces because this component uses default export. Whereas for the footer component, we need to use the curly braces because it uses named export. Once they are imported, everything is going to be common on how we are going to use these components inside our business logic. In the next slide, I also mentioned some important tips around the exports and imports. While you are importing, you can also provide aliases. It is not mandatory to use the same export names inside your import statements. If needed, you can give a different alias name. The same alias name you can use inside your business logic. For example, inside my components file, I have a default export with the name header. I don't have to use the same header name inside my import statement. Instead, I can give a different alias name by giving some different name. For example, here I have mentioned my header. This my header can be used in all the business logic where we have used this import statement. Whereas coming to the named exports, to provide aliases for the named exports, you need to use curly braces as usual. Apart from curly braces, first you need to mention what is the actual component or function name inside other file, followed by what is the alias name that you are trying to use. And in between this actual component name and alias component name, you need to use this as keyword. We can also import all components or all functions as an object. For example, here, by using this syntax asterisk as components, I'm trying to import all the functions or functional components inside this file into this object with the name components. At later point of time inside my code, I can use components.header, components.footer. This is another style that you can also use if you have too many components inside your file. I hope you're clear with all the discussions that we have done so far around export and import. All these are basics around JavaScript. Please make sure you are comfortable with all these basics. The thumb rule that you need to remember from this lecture is always use curly braces for named exports. Otherwise, you can ignore them for default exports.